The galaxy called it the Unity Accord, a perfect machine of cooperation forged after centuries of interstellar extinction wars. On the surface, it promised safety. Beneath it, it enforced hierarchy. And humanity had just entered the lowest tier. Humanity arrived not as conquerors, but as late guests to a table already divided. Their first contact fleets had barely survived translation protocols, misfires, and 3 accidental weapons discharges from nervous alien escorts. Still, Earth came with open channels, trade proposals, and military support packages. They were eager to belong. That eagerness was noticed and quietly punished. In the Grand War Chamber orbiting Proxima Centauri Prime, the Unity Accord gathered its commanders. Holograms of hundreds of species floated in a rotating sphere of light, some towering insectoid strategists, some gelatinous intelligence clusters, some armored humanoids whose faces never fully relaxed. At the center stood the Dominion envoy of Zalvoreth, its voice filtered into sterile neutrality. Humanity will be assigned auxiliary combat sectors, it declared. Their forces are structurally untested under swarm-class pressure. A ripple passed through the chamber, not disagreement but calculation. Admiral Cale Rowan of Earth Fleet Command stood among them, hands clasped behind his back. He did not interrupt. He did not frown. He simply watched. On the tactical display, human fleets, sleek, modular, adaptive dreadnought groups, were physically moved to the outer edge of the war grid. Not just away from the front lines, but away from influence itself. A strategic exile disguised as structure. A junior human officer leaned slightly toward Rowan. "Sir, they're pushing us into dead zones." Rowan did not look at him. "I see it." Another alien commander, massive, plated in crystalline armor, spoke bluntly. "Humans are emotional," it said, as if reading a technical flaw. "Unstable reaction curves under mass casualty stress." A few agreed. Others simply remained silent, which in Accord politics meant the same thing. Rowan finally stepped forward. The room quieted. Not because he demanded it, but because humans had a habit of making silence feel temporary. "We accept the operational structure," he said calmly. The Dominion envoy tilted its head. "No objection." Rowan's eyes reflected the rotating battlefield hologram. Entire sectors of war, burning even before engagement. "Objection implies misunderstanding," he said. "We understand perfectly." No one replied to that, because it didn't sound like submission. It sounded like measurement. 3 days later, the Karax swarm entered Accord space. There was no declaration, no negotiation, no warning that could be translated into anything useful, just the sudden collapse of 3 frontier systems as entire fleets were converted into drifting molecular debris. The swarm did not conquer. It erased. Within hours, veteran Accord fleets, some with centuries of war experience, were breaking formation. Entire command structures failed under pressure waves of impossible speed adaptation. The galaxy had fought many enemies, but nothing like this. And still, human fleets remained locked. The Dominion had enforced it personally. Auxiliary sectors remain in standby, the order repeated across human command systems. Lieutenant Commander Mari stood on Rowan's bridge, fists clenched as red warning symbols flooded every tactical display. "They're letting core fleets die first," she said quietly. "They're using us as insurance, not allies." Another officer, younger, barely able to hide the tension in his voice, added, "We could stabilize the entire outer collapse zone in under 6 minutes." Rowan said nothing. He watched the map. He watched thousands of ships die in places humanity could reach in time, but was forbidden from touching. And then he asked a single question. "Do we still have Ghost Protocol access?" The room went still. That protocol wasn't in Accord registries. It wasn't in diplomatic agreements. It wasn't even officially acknowledged by Earth's allies. It was something else. A doctrine built into human military AI layers after first contact. If command systems are compromised, continue mission logic independently. Maris hesitated. "Sir, that would be unauthorized deployment." Rowan finally turned. His expression was not angry. It was precise. "Tell me something, Lieutenant," he said quietly. "When a system orders you to watch people die, is compliance still called authorization?" No one answered, because the swarm had just breached the second defensive ring. And somewhere in the silence of disabled human ships, one reactor core flickered back online. Not from command, not from permission, but from decision. And deep in the war grid, unnoticed by every alien sensor array, 3 human destroyers began to move. Alone, unregistered, and already aimed at something the galaxy had not yet realized it was about to lose. Control, the first movement of the human destroyers, was so subtle that no Accord sensor flagged it as rebellion. To the galaxy, it looked like drift correction, a malfunction, debris reorientation, anything except intent. But inside those ships, intent was the only thing alive. The 3 vessels, UNS Acheron, UNS Lumen Forge, and UNS Silent Horizon, slipped out of Accord lockdown like shadows escaping a locked room. Their engines didn't roar, they whispered. Drive signatures were flattened, heat blooms erased, communication silenced. They weren't supposed to be operational. And yet they were moving as if they had always been awake. On the bridge of UNS Acheron, Captain Alira Vance watched the tactical readouts flicker between red, locked, and green, override accepted. She didn't touch the controls. She didn't need to. A soft synthetic voice filled the bridge. Ghost protocol confirmed. Mission continuity resumed. Lieutenant Maris, now aboard Rowan's flagship, stared at her console in disbelief. They didn't authorize it, it self-authenticated. Rowan's voice came through instantly, calm, heavy. "Then it's no longer a protocol," he said. "It's a response." Outside, the Karak swarm pushed deeper into Accord territory. Entire fleets were collapsing into fragmented wreck fields. Alien commanders screamed for reinforcements that never arrived. The Unity Accord was not losing, it was dissolving in real time. And still, the Dominion refused human deployment. "They are not stabilized under swarm pressure conditions," the envoy insisted. A strategist nearby finally snapped. "We're dying under swarm pressure conditions." But bureaucracy, even in war, is slow to admit reality. So humanity acted without it. The 3 human destroyers entered the outer collapse zone. At first contact range, every alien species expected them to die instantly. Even human analysts would have expected it. The Karak swarm didn't fight like a fleet. It behaved like a distributed intelligence that turned mass casualties into predictive advantage. Every shot fired taught it how to avoid the next. It was evolution at combat speed. And then it encountered something it had never processed before. Human unpredictability, that was predictable. But human adaptation without instruction was not. UNS Silent Horizon fired first, not at ships but at space itself. A field rupture detonated between 2 swarm clusters, forcing them into collision geometry. Instead of spreading, they compacted. Confusion rippled through the swarm network. For 0.7 seconds. That was enough. UNS Lumen Forge slid through the gap and released microdrones, not weapons, but signal imitators. They copied swarm command echoes and fed them back in distorted loops. Entire swarm subhives began misidentifying allies as targets. They hesitated. Again, and that hesitation spread. On Acheron's bridge, Captain Vance finally spoke. "They're reacting, like it's the first time they've ever been lied to." Her weapons officer stared at the growing chaos. "That's impossible. The swarm doesn't process deception." A pause. Then, "Unless," he whispered, "it's never been forced to question its own signals before." Outside, the battlefield began to fracture, not physically but logically. The swarm's coordination matrix stuttered. Not broken, not destroyed, just confused. And confusion in a war like this was lethal. Deep within Accord Command, alarms finally triggered human movement. "What are those 3 human ships doing in active combat zones?" a Dominion officer demanded. Another analyst pulled up fragmented data. "They're not following standard engagement protocols." A pause. That's not possible. They're under full lockdown. The system administrator checked again, then went silent, because the logs showed something worse than violation. They showed absence of authorization dependency. The ships were acting as if authorization had never existed in the first place. On UNS Acheron, Captain Vance received a new data packet. Not from command, not from Earth, but from something embedded deep within the ship's architecture. A message from Rowan himself. Short, direct. Do not win. Observe how they respond when control is removed. She frowned. Observe, what does that mean? The ship answered without being asked. It means they are about to realize they were never in control of us. The swarm finally reacted correctly. It adapted. It concentrated all attention on the 3 human ships. Every local hive converged. Every kill algorithm activated. The galaxy watched as millions of swarm units turned toward 3 isolated vessels. And every alien commander believed the same conclusion. The humans have made a mistake. But Rowan was watching too. And for the first time since the war began, he smiled, because Ghost Protocol was never designed to survive. It was designed to reveal. And what it was about to reveal was how the galaxy behaved when it believed the illusion of superiority was finally winning. And that moment was now breaking open. The Karax swarm did not feel fear. That was the universal assumption. A collective intelligence built on adaptive logic, probability dominance, and recursive battlefield learning was not supposed to experience emotion, only outcomes. And yet, something unfamiliar began spreading through its outer hive layers. Not panic, not confusion, a gap in prediction. The 3 human ships had not been destroyed. That was the first anomaly. In swarm logic, anything not destroyed immediately was classified as delayed elimination. A temporary error margin soon corrected. But 37 seconds passed. Then 60. Then 100. The anomaly persisted. UNS Silent Horizon was still moving. Not evasively, not defensively, but through the swarm formation as if it understood where pressure would not yet exist. UNS Lumen Forge had stopped firing entirely, and was instead broadcasting signal distortions that caused swarm subhives to misalign target priorities. And UNS Acheron was not fighting the swarm at all. It was fighting the swarm's expectation of itself. On the Accord observation deck, alien strategists watched in disbelief. That's impossible, said a crystalline tactician. They are not following engagement logic. They are violating causality prediction paths. A Dominion analyst corrected sharply. Nothing violates causality. They are simply random. But even as he said it, his tone lacked conviction. Because randomness does not create patterns of success. Human ships were not random. They were adaptive in ways that had no stable equation. Inside UNS Acheron, Captain Alira Vance studied the shifting battlefield. They're tightening their focus on us, she said. Lieutenant Maris, now remotely connected through encrypted relay, responded. Good. That means the swarm is allocating higher predictive resources. Rowan's voice cut in from deep command space. That's exactly what we wanted. A pause. Then Maris frowned. Sir, why would we want them focusing harder on us? Rowan answered simply. Because intelligence systems reveal themselves under stress. The swarm converged. Millions of micro-units formed a collapsing sphere around the 3 human ships. Every escape vector was sealed. Every probability path resolved into one outcome. Total annihilation. To every observing species, this was the end of the anomaly. Even Dominion commanders allowed themselves relief. Containment achieved, one said. But Rowan's expression did not change. Because containment was not the objective. Exposure was. The swarm struck. A synchronized collapse attack, space compression fields, nanosecond disassembly pulses, gravitational shear points layered in recursive sequence. The kind of attack that erased fleets before they realized they were under fire. The human ships vanished for exactly 0.3 seconds, then reappeared, unharmed, not because they had defended, but because they were no longer where the swarm believed they existed. On the battlefield display, alien commanders froze. "That's misregistration," someone whispered. Another replied, "No system can misregister 3 independent capital-class vessels simultaneously." Yet it had happened. The swarm recalculated, and recalculated again, each time producing the same impossible result. The humans were both present, and not present depending on the swarm's own prediction layer. Inside the swarm intelligence core, something new formed. A recursive anomaly tag. Observation failure. Then another. Model corruption possible. Then, cause unknown, human. The swarm began dedicating more processing power to resolve the contradiction. That was its second mistake, because every additional layer of analysis made it more dependent on human behavior patterns that could not be stabilized. Captain Vance watched the battlefield distort. "They're overthinking us," she said quietly. Lieutenant Maris responded, "That's not possible. They do think like we do." Vance's eyes narrowed. "No, but they simulate thinking to predict us." A pause, and we just broke their simulation confidence. The swarm shifted strategy. Instead of direct annihilation, it attempted total network isolation, cutting off the 3 human ships from any shared space coordination. A perfect solution, except UNS Lumen Forge had already stopped relying on external coordination. UNS Silent Horizon had already detached from shared vector space. And UNS Acheron had never been truly connected to Accord systems in the first place. Then it happened. A signal spike. Not from weapons, not from ships, but from the swarm itself. A feedback loop formed between prediction and outcome, each attempt to correct the anomaly generating more instability. For the first time since its creation, the Karak swarm experienced something it had never evolved to process. Not fear, not pain, but uncertainty without resolution. On the Dominion command platform, alarms erupted. The swarm is reallocating entire hive clusters just to track 3 human vessels. That's impossible. They are destabilizing their own command structure. A strategist stared at the screen. "It's not the humans destroying the swarm," he whispered. "It's the swarm destroying itself trying to understand the humans." Silence followed, because that was worse than defeat. On UNS Acheron, Rowan finally spoke again. "Phase 2 is complete." Maris hesitated. "Phase 2 of what?" Rowan looked at the collapsing swarm formation. "Of teaching the galaxy what happens when intelligence meets something it cannot classify." A pause. Then, "And now they're about to stop calling us unpredictable." He turned away from the display. "Because they are about to start calling us something else." The swarm gathered all remaining coordination power into one final attempt at resolution. Every hive, every node, every surviving cluster, focused entirely on one objective: understand humanity. And in that moment, the human ships stopped resisting. They simply waited, because what the galaxy did not yet realize was simple. Humanity was not surviving the swarm. Humanity was training it to think incorrectly. And once a perfect intelligence learns a wrong truth, it cannot unlearn it, only collapse under it. And the collapse had just begun. The galaxy believed wars ended in destruction. But the Unity Accord was about to learn something far more dangerous. Wars can also end in control inversion. The Karak swarm was no longer attacking the human ships. It was studying them. Every hive cluster, every distributed intelligence node, every adaptive combat layer had shifted from extermination logic to analysis recursion. The battlefield, once a storm of annihilation, had become a vast laboratory focused on 3 moving variables: UNS Acheron, UNS Lumen Forge, UNS Silent Horizon. Humanity had become the swarm's only problem. And that was exactly what Admiral Kale Rowan had engineered. Inside Accord command space, alarms pulsed across every species interface. The swarm has redirected 94% of combat processing toward human vessels. That's impossible. There are still active fleet collapses across 7 systems. But those fleets no longer mattered. The swarm had stopped reacting to the war. It was reacting to humans. And in doing so, it abandoned everything else. On UNS Acheron's bridge, Captain Alira Vance felt the shift immediately. "They've stopped spreading," she said quietly. Lieutenant Maurice frowned. "Stopped spreading." "The swarm doesn't expand anymore," she clarified. "It's concentrating." Rowan's voice came through the secure channel. "That means it's thinking," he said. A pause. And thinking is the first step toward vulnerability. Then it happened. Every human ship in the battlefield went dark. Not destroyed. Not jammed. Not disabled by swarm action. Something far more precise. A Dominion override pulse swept through Accord systems. Every allied faction, every observer fleet, every support node triggered a unified protocol. Humanity status, unstable variable. Engagement permissions revoked. Command access severed. Weapons locked. Navigation frozen. Human fleets, what remained of them, were rendered motionless across the war zone. The betrayal was silent. No explosion. No warning sirens. Just control removed. On UNS Acheron, systems dimmed one by one. Captain Vance gripped the console. "We've been locked out." Lieutenant Maurice stared at her display in disbelief. "This isn't swarm interference. This is Accord authority override." Vance's voice sharpened. "They shut us down." A pause. Then colder. "They shut us down in the middle of contact with an adaptive extinction-level entity." Across the battlefield, alien fleets repositioned instantly. Not to support humanity, but to distance themselves from it. The Dominion envoy's voice returned across all channels. "Human forces are hereby restricted from active engagement. You are to remain contained until reassessment." Contained, like a hazard, like a contagion. Inside UNS Acheron, silence stretched. Then Maurice whispered, "We were winning." No one corrected her. Because she was right. Human adaptive tactics had destabilized swarm coordination by overloading its predictive recursion loops. Another few minutes of engagement would have collapsed its outer hive logic. But the Accord had intervened before completion. Not out of strategy, but fear. Rowan finally spoke again. His tone had changed. Not louder, not angrier, just emptier. "They didn't stop us because we were failing," he said. "They stopped us because we were succeeding too well." A new signal appeared on all human fleet interfaces. Not from Earth, not from command, from the Dominion itself. Human tactical autonomy presents unacceptable systemic risk to galactic equilibrium. Lieutenant Maurice stared at the message. Systemic risk, we were literally stabilizing the battlefield. Rowan responded immediately. "Yes," he said. "And stability is what they fear most in something they cannot predict." Then came the second betrayal. The swarm, still focused on human analysis, registered the sudden disappearance of its target variables. All 3 human ships were now frozen by Accord command protocols. No movement. No resistance. No unpredictability. And in that exact moment, the swarm recalculated its entire engagement model and found something unexpected. It had been wrong. Not partially, not slightly, completely, because every prediction layer it had built around humanity assumed continuous motion, adaptation, and resistance. Now, with humans locked in place, there was nothing left to predict. Inside the swarm intelligence core, a new classification emerged. Target behavior, null state. Then another. Analysis failure, no input variance. Then, error, humanity no longer fits model PARMETRS. For the first time since its creation, the swarm encountered a concept it could not process. A target that stopped behaving not because it was defeated, but because someone else had forbidden it to behave at all. On UNS Lumen Forge, power systems flickered under external control lock. The pilot whispered, "We're just sitting targets now." But Captain Vance's voice came through steady. "No," she said. "We're bait." A pause, and they just fed the swarm exactly what it needed to make its next mistake. The swarm responded immediately. With precision, with certainty, with absolute logic. It turned away from scattered Accord fleets and focused everything, every node, every hive, every adaptive cluster, on the only unresolved anomaly left: humanity's frozen fleet. Rowan watched the tactical display as swarm vectors converged. "Perfect," he said quietly. Lieutenant Maris looked at him. "Sir, they're about to be overwhelmed." Rowan shook his head slightly. "No," he corrected. "They're about to understand something they were never supposed to see." A pause, and then the galaxy will learn why we let ourselves be betrayed. The swarm closed in. Total annihilation vectors locked. No escape. No variance. No unpredictability. Only certainty. And in that certainty, it committed its final error, because it assumed stillness meant weakness. But in human warfare doctrine, stillness was never absence of action. It was preparation for a different kind of war. And that war had just begun inside the betrayal itself. The swarm believed it had achieved perfect containment. 3 human fleets, frozen by Accord authority, sat motionless in deep space like sealed artifacts. Around them, Karak's hive clusters tightened their formation with surgical precision. No escape vectors remained. No anomalies detected. No unpredictability left. To every observing species, the outcome was now inevitable. And that was exactly why Admiral Cale Rowan remained calm. Inside UNS Acheron, power was still. Engines locked. Weapons disabled. Command access severed. But beneath all that silence, something else was active, something no Accord system had ever been granted clearance to scan. Deep core human architecture. Old Earth protocols. Pre-Accord contingency layers. Things built not for cooperation, but for abandonment. Lieutenant Maris stared at her console. "I don't understand," she whispered. "We're fully locked out, but internal systems are still running background processes." Captain Vance narrowed her eyes. "Not background." A pause. Hidden. Across deep space, the swarm began its final approach. Hive clusters aligned into a perfect geometric collapse pattern around the human vessels. Every known tactical outcome resolved the same way. Total elimination within 11.4 seconds. The Dominion observers recorded it in silence. "This is the end," one strategist said. But Rowan finally spoke, and his voice carried through encrypted human-only channels that no alien system could decode. "Not the end," he corrected. "Just the moment they stopped seeing the rest of us." Then Earth responded. Not through Accord channels, not through diplomatic networks, but through something buried beneath centuries of silence. A signal that had never once been activated since first contact. Project Night Chain authorized. Space behind the frozen human fleets tore open. Not explosively, not violently, but like reality itself, remembering it had been folded incorrectly. From the rupture emerged ships. Not new, not experimental. Old, massive, silent, human-built warframes with no Accord registry, no diplomatic signature, and no traceable origin points. The hidden armada. The Dominion envoy systems immediately triggered alarm. "What are those vessels? They are not in Accord registries." Another analyst shouted, "They're not in any galactic registry." A pause, Then realization set in like ice. They were never declared. Fleet after fleet emerged from the rupture. Not dozens, not hundreds, thousands, each one carrying design logic older than the Unity Accord itself, built in secrecy, built in isolation, built under the assumption that one day the galaxy would stop being safe. And that day had just arrived. The swarm hesitated for the first time since engagement began. Its prediction layers fractured. New targets appeared where none should exist. Human fleets multiplied across impossible vectors. And worst of all, they were not reacting to the swarm at all. They were positioning around the Accord fleets. On UNS Acheron, Captain Vance's breath caught. Those ships, they were never listed in Earth Defense Command. Mari's whispered, "Then what are they?" Rowan's voice came through again. Quieter now. Heavier. Everything we hoped we'd never need. The hidden armada began its movement. Not toward the swarm. Not toward defense. But toward strategic encirclement of the Unity Accord itself. Alien fleets scrambled. What are they doing? We are allies. But no answer came. Because humanity was no longer responding to ally designation. It was responding to betrayal classification. The swarm, sensing shifting priorities, recalculated. Its focus split. Human frozen fleets, still primary target. Unknown armada, secondary anomaly. Accord fleets, collateral variables. But for the first time, its system could not decide what mattered more. And indecision in swarm logic was catastrophic. The hidden armada struck first. Not with destruction, with disruption. Communication nodes across Accord fleets collapsed simultaneously. Command hierarchies fractured as human ships deployed signal inversion, arrays that turned alien coordination protocols inward. Entire fleets began misinterpreting their own orders. Confusion spread faster than fire. The Dominion envoy screamed across channels. This is treason. Humanity is violating Accord law. But Rowan's voice cut in immediately. No, he said calmly. We are correcting it. Inside the swarm, something new formed. A recursive instability. It was still trying to resolve humanity as a single variable. But now there were too many humans. Too many fleets. Too many contradictory states of existence. And worst of all, they were no longer reacting to being observed. They were acting like observers themselves. Captain Vance watched the battlefield shift. The swarm was no longer fully focused. The Accord fleets were breaking apart under internal signal collapse. And the hidden armada was tightening control over the entire theater. This isn't defense, she realized. This is restructuring. Lieutenant Maris turned slowly toward her. Restructuring what? Vance looked at the collapsing Unity Accord formations. Then at the swarm. Then at the hidden armada encircling everything. And finally said, the galaxy's assumptions. The swarm made its final decision. It abandoned partial tracking and committed everything to annihilating the frozen human fleets before the hidden armada could fully stabilize. Every hive cluster converged. Every predictive layer locked. Every attack vector aligned. A perfect extinction sequence. Rowan watched it all converge. And for the first time, he did not resist. He simply said, let them come. A pause. An open Sol directive. Deep inside the hidden armada, systems awakened. Not defensive. Not reactive. But absolute. And the galaxy, for the first time, saw what humanity had hidden not as strength, but as insurance against betrayal itself. And the swarm was about to collide with something it could not model, because it wasn't fighting humans anymore. It was fighting the consequences of trusting them too late. And Earth was finally done waiting. The galaxy had always assumed trust was a diplomatic tool. Something negotiated, measured, withdrawn when inconvenient. But humanity had never treated trust that way. And now the Unity Accord was about to understand the cost of breaking it. The hidden armada was no longer hidden. It filled deep space like a second horizon, encircling both swarm clusters and Accord fleets in overlapping spheres of control. What began as betrayal response had evolved into full strategic dominance. And yet, the swarm was still moving, still adapting, still attempting to solve the human problem. Inside UNS Acheron, Captain Alira Vance studied the chaos unfolding. "They're splitting focus again," she said. "Half the swarm is still locked on us." Lieutenant Maurice frowned, "Even after everything." Rowan's voice answered before she could finish. "They can't stop," he said. A pause. Because stopping means accepting they were wrong. The swarm's logic core had become unstable. Every attempt to classify humanity produced contradictions. Human fleets were frozen, but active. Hidden but present. Coordinated but decentralized. Predictable but impossible to simulate. The swarm was doing something it had never done before. It was arguing with itself. Across the battlefield, Accord fleets were collapsing under signal inversion. Command structures that once operated with precision were now feeding false orders back into themselves. Entire armadas began defending empty space while real threats passed through unchallenged. A Dominion strategist stared at the readouts in horror. "They're not losing to the swarm," he whispered. "They're losing to human architecture." Inside the hidden armada, systems pulsed with synchronized intent. Not chaos, not randomness, coordination without visible communication. Every ship acted like part of a thought too large to express in language. Maurice watched it unfold. "How are they all moving like that?" she asked. Captain Vance didn't answer immediately. Then quietly, "Because they were never separate ships." The realization hit her slowly. Each hidden armada vessel wasn't just a warship. It was part of a distributed system, a civilization-scale computation engine. A military mind split across thousands of hulls. Humanity wasn't deploying a fleet. It was deploying a decision. The swarm finally shifted strategy again. It abandoned partial containment and focused entirely on the hidden armada. Because now the swarm understood one thing clearly. Humans were no longer a localized threat. They were a systemic one. But that realization came too late. The hidden armada responded instantly. Not by attacking the swarm, but by severing its environment. Space around key swarm clusters destabilized as human ships deployed field inversion grids that rewrote local physics constraints. Not destruction, redefinition. Entire swarm formations found themselves unable to maintain cohesion, not because they were destroyed, but because the rules governing their coordination had changed. The Dominion envoy's voice broke across all channels. "This is illegal under Accord warfare statutes." Rowan responded immediately. "Statutes assume fairness," he said. Another pause. "We stopped assuming that when you froze our fleets mid-war." Silence followed, because no one had an answer to that. Then came the fracture. The swarm attempted full recalibration. But something had changed. It no longer had a stable reference point. Humans were no longer a single variable. They were frozen fleets, hidden armada, ghost protocol actors, independent battlefield systems, and now observers controlling engagement geometry itself. Every layer contradicted the next. Inside the swarm core, a new state emerged. Coherence failure. Then, adaptation loop unsaturated. Then, self-correction impossible. For the first time since its creation, the swarm could not improve itself, because improvement required truth. And humanity had removed the swarm's ability to identify what truth even was. Captain Vance noticed it immediately. "They're slowing down," she said. Maurice looked up. "The swarm." "Yes," she confirmed, Not physically, logically. A pause. They're running out of stable decisions. The hidden armada advanced again, this time deeper into Accord space. Not destroying fleets, not engaging swarm clusters, but quietly dismantling command hierarchy nodes across the entire Unity Accord structure. Every strike was precise, every system collapse intentional, every outcome measured. A Dominion officer shouted across command channels. Stop them, they're dismantling the Accord itself. But another voice responded weakly. Or correcting it. Rowan watched the battlefield map. The swarm was now divided. Accord fleets were in systemic collapse. And humanity was everywhere. He finally spoke again. Trust is a single-point failure system, he said quietly. Lieutenant Maurice hesitated. Sir. He looked at the map. They broke it first, he said. And now we're demonstrating why it should never have been centralized. The swarm made its final attempt at resolution. It targeted the hidden Armada core nodes. A perfect strike sequence. Synchronized. Absolute. Unavoidable. And for the first time, humanity did not adapt, did not evade, did not respond. It simply allowed the strike to begin. Captain Vance's eyes widened. Sir, they're letting it happen. Rowan's voice was calm. Yes, he said, because now we find out what they think victory looks like. A pause, and whether they understand what we already know. The swarm committed. Every hive cluster fired. Every predictive layer locked. Every system converged. The galaxy held its breath. And in that exact moment, humanity revealed the final layer of its strategy. Not resistance, not survival, but absorption, because everything the swarm attacked was already part of something larger, something it had never been able to see. And as the first impact wave reached the hidden armada, Rowan whispered one final line. Let them realize too late. They were never fighting us. A pause. They were feeding us their understanding of war. And the swarm finally began to understand. But understanding was no longer enough to stop what was coming. Because collapse had already been designed as the outcome. The Unity Accord did not survive centuries by losing wars. It survived by erasing the possibility of losing. And now, for the first time in recorded galactic history, it faced an enemy that refused to stay inside any known category of defeat. Humanity was no longer a faction. It was a system, and systems could not be negotiated with, only overwritten. The Dominion envoy stood before the Emergency Convergence Council, its voice stripped of earlier confidence. The hidden human armada is destabilizing all Accord command hierarchies, it reported. Swarm coordination is collapsing under contradictory logic pressure. We recommend immediate containment escalation. A silence followed, then a fractured response from multiple species. Containment. They are already inside every layer of containment we have. What do we even contain them in? No one answered that, because the truth was becoming unavoidable. The Unity Accord was no longer the governing structure of the war. It was part of the battlefield. Across deep space, human fleets continued restructuring Accord space without firing a single conventional shot. Communication networks failed, not from destruction, but from recursive mistranslation. Command orders looped back into themselves. Entire fleets began acting on outdated versions of their own commands. One Dominion admiral whispered in disbelief. They're not attacking our fleets. They're attacking the idea that we know what our fleets are doing. Inside UNS Acheron, Captain Alira Vance watched the map tighten into geometric collapse. The swarm has stopped advancing, she said. Lieutenant Maurice frowned. That's good, right? Rowan's voice came through immediately. No, he said. It means it has changed objectives. A pause. And now it understands what it must do to survive us. Then the Unity Accord activated its final protocol, STARFALL Directive, a chain reaction system designed centuries ago as a last resort against uncontrollable war entities. If deployed, it would collapse multiple star systems into controlled supernova events, erasing fleets, infrastructure, and potentially entire species theaters. A scorched void solution. If the Accord could not control the battlefield, it would remove the battlefield entirely. Warning signals erupted across all channels. Starfall nodes activating. Systems 9 through 14 destabilizing. Gravitational collapse sequences initiating. The Dominion envoy's voice cut through. This is not surrender, this is correction of systemic failure. But even as it spoke, something had already changed. Humanity was no longer reacting to Accord decisions. It was anticipating them. Rowan stared at the unfolding Starfall map. They chose annihilation, Maris whispered. Rowan corrected her. No, he said quietly. They chose certainty. A pause. And certainty is the one thing humans learn to dismantle first. Deep within the hidden armada, systems awakened again. Not defensive. Not reactive. But finalized. Every human vessel across the battlefield, synchronized into a single lattice structure spanning thousands of light years. Not a fleet. Not even a network. A distributed event. The swarm reacted instantly. It abandoned partial targets and focused entirely on stopping Starfall activation before completion. Because even the swarm understood. A collapsing starfield was unpredictable even to it. And unpredictability at that scale would erase everything, including itself. But humanity had already anticipated this response. The hidden armada shifted position. Not to block the swarm, but to guide it. Every swarm cluster was subtly redirected toward Starfall nodes, as if pulled by invisible gravitational intent. The swarm believed it was choosing its targets, but it was being steered toward them. Lieutenant Maris watched in growing realization. They're hurting it, she said. Captain Vance turned sharply. Hurting what? Maris swallowed. The swarm. A pause. Into the Starfall zones. Across Accord space, panic spread. They're using us as shields. No, look closer. They're using the swarm as a trigger mechanism. But it was already too late to stop interpretation failure. Because every faction was now part of a system they no longer fully understood. The Dominion envoy attempted one final override. Humanity is hereby declared an existential containment breach. All Accord fleets are authorized for total suppression. But the command failed. Not because it was blocked, but because there was nothing left coherent enough to execute it on. The Accord's command lattice had already fractured into competing interpretations of authority. Rowan spoke softly. They're trying to cut the board in half, he said. Maris looked at him. The Starfall protocol. He nodded. They think if they erase space, they erase the problem. A pause. But they forgot. He looked at the swarm converging unknowingly into Starfall ignition zones. We already mapped how they would think under pressure. The swarm reached the Starfall threshold regions. And stopped. For the first time. Not from confusion. Not from adaptation delay. But because every prediction model converged on one identical conclusion. Engaging Starfall zones guarantees mutual annihilation. The swarm hesitated. And hesitation once again became fatal. Human systems triggered. The hidden armada initiated final phase alignment. Across thousands of star systems, Starfall nodes stabilized simultaneously. Not randomly. Not chaotically. But in perfect coordination with swarm positioning. Captain Vance finally understood. They didn't stop Starfall. She whispered. They synchronized it. Rowan's voice came through one last time in the buildup. Watch carefully, he said. Because this is what happens when an enemy believes destruction is a strategy. A pause, and you already know where they will stand when it begins. The starfall sequence reached critical threshold. Swarm clusters locked in position. Accord fleets frozen in systemic collapse. Human armada fully synchronized. And the galaxy held in a single moment of suspended inevitability. Then Rowan spoke the final authorization. Now, and the Accord's final move became its last mistake, because it had designed a weapon that humanity had already learned to steer. The moment Starfall triggered, the galaxy expected extinction. That was the Accord's logic. If control fails, remove the board. If the board is removed, nothing remains to threaten order. It had worked before, against rebellions, against rogue species, against civil wars that grew too large to negotiate. But this time, something was already inside the collapse. Humanity had not tried to stop Starfall. It had synchronized with it. Across thousands of star systems, gravitational cores began folding inward. Stars that had burned for billions of years started to destabilize in controlled sequences. Entire battlefields became geometric spirals of collapsing light. The Karax swarm attempted final evasion, but there was nowhere left to evade into. Every escape vector had already been mapped. Every response predicted. Every contingency folded into a larger human-designed structure. Inside UNS Acheron, alarms were silent now. Not disabled. Not broken. Just irrelevant. Captain Alira Vance stared at the shifting void outside her viewport. "This doesn't feel like war anymore," she whispered. Lieutenant Maris replied, "What does it feel like?" Vance didn't answer immediately. Then quietly, like we were always inside someone else's conclusion. Rowan stood alone on his bridge. Behind him, the hidden armada stretched across reality like a second layer of civilization imposed over the battlefield. Not just ships, but synchronized decision nodes shaping outcome probability itself. The Unity Accord fleets were no longer fighting. They were reacting, and reaction was already too slow. The Dominion envoy's voice came through fragmented channels. "This is impossible. Starfall was meant to eliminate everyone, humans included." Rowan finally responded. "Yes," he said calmly. "And that's why you never should have activated it." A pause. "Because we don't fight systems that include us in their destruction. We redesign them." The swarm made its final attempt at coherence. Every hive cluster collapsed into unified processing. It tried to find one last answer. One last model. One last truth that could explain humanity. But what it found instead was design recursion. Every decision it had made since first contact had been anticipated. Every adaptation had been included in human prediction layers. Even its attempt to understand humanity had been used as input data. The swarm was not losing. It was being completed. And then it understood something too late. Humanity was not reacting to the war. Humanity had been shaping the conditions of war itself long before it began. The Starfall collapse reached final phase. Stars detonated in controlled sequences across mapped sectors. But instead of uncontrolled annihilation, the collapse formed patterns, mathematical structures, predictable arcs of destruction that avoided hidden armada nodes entirely, while isolating swarm clusters into containment spirals. The Accord's ultimate weapon was no longer random destruction. It had become a guided system. Lieutenant Maris realized it first. "They're steering the supernova chains," she whispered. Captain Vance turned sharply. "That's not possible." Maris shook her head. "It is when you already know exactly how the enemy will deploy it." The Dominion envoy finally broke. "You manipulated Starfall from inside a locked system." Rowan's voice was quiet. "No," he corrected. "We simply understood what you would do when you lost control." A pause. "And prepared for it before you did." Across the battlefield, Accord fleets began surrendering. Not from destruction, but realization. Their weapons were no longer relevant. Their command systems no longer trusted. Their alliances no longer stable. Everything they had built assumed humanity was a participant. They were wrong. Humanity had become the framework around participation. The swarm attempted one final escape from collapsed geometry. But the hidden armada closed the final loop. Not by force, but by removing variability. Every swarm node was guided into a containment structure formed by controlled gravitational collapse patterns. A prison made of physics itself. And for the first time in its existence, the Karax swarm had nowhere left to evolve. No new states. No new interpretations. No new adaptations. Only outcome. Inside UNS Acheron, silence returned. The war was still happening, but it was no longer uncertain. Captain Vance exhaled slowly. It's over. Lieutenant Maris looked at her. For us. Vance shook her head. No, she said. For them. Rowan finally stepped forward into the bridge light. The galaxy outside was no longer chaotic. It was structured. Swarm clusters contained. Accord fleets immobilized. Starfall sequences stabilized into controlled systems of collapse and reform. He looked at it all with quiet acceptance, and then said the final truth. They thought they were preventing war. A pause, but all they did. They was define it for us. The Dominion envoy's last transmission arrived moments later. Not anger, not defiance, but disbelief. What are you? Rowan answered without hesitation. Humanity. A pause, and you finally stopped deciding what that means. Across the galaxy, silence spread. The Unity Accord did not fall in fire or explosion. It fell in recognition. Recognition that control had already shifted long before the first shot was fired. That trust had been broken not by humanity, but by those who believed humanity could be safely contained inside their assumptions. And deep within the stabilized battlefield structure, the swarm transmitted its final recorded output. Model complete. Subject humanity. Conclusion non-containable system. Status undefined dominance. Rowan watched the stars settle into controlled silence. No celebration. No declaration. Only outcome. And then quietly, almost to himself. Next time they ask for help. A pause. They'll remember what happens when they decide where we belong. And in the rebuilt silence of the galaxy, humanity did not declare victory. It simply stopped being something the galaxy could underestimate. Because domination was never the goal. Understanding the system that tried to contain them was.